I are two of the three MEPs representing the North East. We were elected in May 2013. We replaced Stephen Hughes, who before the 2014 elections, in the North East we have three MEPs. We had one Labour, one Tory and one Lib Dem. And now we have two Labour and one UKIP MEP. And our victory, if you like, in May 2014 was that we knocked out the leader of the Conservative group in the European Parliament, who was Martin Callanan, the North East Tory MEP. And he really expected to be returned to the European Parliament. So that was quite a big achievement, and it was largely down to the fact that there was a really big mobilisation locally. And to be fair, County Durham played a really big part in that, because across Teesside, UKIP came first in all five local authorities across Teesside. But the County Durham Labour vote really delivered two Labour MEPs into the European Parliament. So what we've tried to do is, we promised when we stood as candidates that we would prioritise three big areas, and those were jobs in the region, because the one thing that this region really needs is more jobs. We have a historic, because of deindustrialisation, historic legacy of unemployment. But European investment and access to that European market have really driven job creation, new job creation across the region, whether that's big high-profile cases like Nissan, or it's much smaller companies and smaller kind of job creation projects. There's everything in the North East. So one of our main priorities was jobs. The second was investment, trying to ensure that public money that we received is used as effectively as possible, with a long-term agenda, which isn't about creating kind of revolving doors of projects which don't bed down and deliver long-term benefits for the region, but actually a part of a kind of long-term sustainable agenda for the region. So the investment dimension. And the third, and that's where I come from, because before I was elected, I was an elected trade unionist, is about rights, and particularly rights at work. The vast majority of our rights at work in the UK now stem from European legislation. This Tory government and the coalition government before them have pulled back as much as they can at national level. They've tried to argue that basic health and safety standards are red tape, a burden on business, putting too much pressure on business, rather than actually about creating good, safe workplaces which ensure that people can have a long and healthy life, rather than being crippled or worse as a result of their workplace. So that rights agenda is really important for us. And that's basically what Paul and I have been doing in the European Parliament, pushing forward those three areas. Now, we didn't divide up the region geographically. In the past, you've had a kind of Durham MEP, a Tyne and Wear MEP, Northumberland MEP, Teesside MEP. We decided not to do that. We thought that we would do it thematically, so that we're both covering all of the region. And if you look at our diaries through the space of a month, you'll see that Paul and I hit every part of the region once every month, at least once, depending on what else is going on. So we divide thematically because Paul is on the Agriculture Committee of the European Parliament. So he's actually Labour's national spokesperson on agricultural policy, the Common Agricultural Policy, one of the strongest parts of European Union policy. And he speaks for Labour in the Agriculture Committee, but it also is a committee which deals with the rural economy. So what he's trying to do is to put more and more emphasis on how you create jobs, you diversify the rural economy, so that basically rural areas aren't just a commuter belt for the urban areas, but that you're promoting local businesses and economic development and diversification in rural areas as well. And at the moment, one of the things that he's working on is a big report in the European Parliament on rural jobs, how to ensure a kind of vibrant rural community where people, if they want to, can live and work in rural areas. And the North East, the interesting thing is now we're one of the only places in the country which has rural Labour MPs. So Pat Glass and Kevin Jones, for example, or Graham Morris in Easington, represent large rural, particularly Pat Glass with all of that kind of Weardale, Hinter land, but they represent large rural constituencies. In the UK, most rural constituencies are now Tory MPs, so it makes it a quite interesting dynamic to try and develop a better Labour policy nationally for rural areas as well. So that's kind of some of the stuff that Paul's doing. I'm in 2 committees, I'm in 3 committees, but I'll tell you about 2 of them in the European Parliament. The first is the International Trade Committee. So that's the committee which is responsible for scrutinising and monitoring all of the EU's trade agreements and trade relations with other parts of the world. What we've decided as 28 member states is that we're stronger negotiating with other third countries in the world if we negotiate as a single bloc, because then you're negotiating as 500 million people rather than just as 60 million people in the UK. And the trade deals that you can develop with other areas around the world are far more advantageous, I would say, for the UK and for the EU because of that negotiating weight. Now, one of the big trade negotiations that I'm following, and if you're interested we can talk about it, but I won't talk for too long so that you can ask any questions or whatever you're interested in. One of the big things that I'm following is this big EU-US trade negotiation, which is called TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It would be the biggest trade deal, bilateral trade deal ever negotiated if the talks concluded. We've taken a very, very hard line as a Labour group in the European Parliament, saying that we will veto any trade deal which includes public services in any respect, including the NHS, social services, education. That includes any kind of private justice system for multinational companies. There's been a lot of concern about something called investor state dispute settlement, which is essentially a private justice system which has existed since the 1950s, but in the last 20 years has been used as a tool for hyper-globalisation, basically. It's been used by big multinational companies to challenge democratically elected governments when they've put in place legislation which is in the public interest, whether that's... Most of the companies who've used this tool have been tobacco companies trying to avoid plain packaging or anti-smoking legislation, or oil and gas companies who are fighting against blocks to fracking and non-conventional oil and gas exploration. So this tool, we just don't see that there's any need to have it in a trade deal with the US. If there was a private arbitration system inside this deal, you would be giving a massive gift to the corporate world. And I don't understand anybody who's democratically elected representing the general population who would give power from democratically elected representatives to the corporate private sector. So that's one of the key lines. And then the third key line, and these key lines actually now increasingly cover all of our trade relations with different parts of the world. But the third is that trade should be about not just benefiting vested interests, but about benefiting the whole of society. So what we should be pushing for is for a lifting of standards globally. Standards when it comes to environmental protection, standards around labour rights, workers' rights, consumer protection, rights around ensuring that trade isn't promoting exploitation. And that's one of the big themes that we follow through all of these trade negotiations. So lots and lots is going on. TTIP is kind of the most sexy part of our agenda. It's the one that lots of people want to talk about, but it's actually only a small part of what we do. One of the really fascinating things, I think, if people are interested in kind of the fair trade movement and some of the community developments which have come from the labour movement in the UK, is we're now working on ensuring responsibility along supply chains. I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there was a textile factory which collapsed in Bangladesh, the Rana Plaza textile factory. Well, as a result of the collapse of that textile factory, for the first time there was an international textile agreement which was about ensuring that the big clothes companies, who are kind of at the top of the pecking order, who then dictate the prices and terms and conditions right down to their supply chain, that they're more responsible for the conditions of the people working at the bottom of the pecking order. And what we're trying to do is to push that supply chain responsibility across the whole of the economy, working with governments around the world to push for a fairer globalisation, because at the moment we have a very unfair global marketplace which is putting worker and worker into competition with each other, and increasingly, if we want to tackle climate change, it's having a negative effect on the environment as well. So lots in the Trade Committee. The second big committee is the Industry Committee, Industry, Research and Energy. And I think it's appropriate that an MEP representing the North East, which provided the energy for the Industrial Revolution, is now in the Energy Committee of the European Parliament. What we're pushing forward is the next Industrial Revolution, in effect. We're working with partners across the EU to build up an energy grid which will provide many jobs for the North East, and try and convert lots of existing jobs to build up a renewables energy grid across the North Sea. I don't know if you've heard about the Dogger Bank. It's the biggest wind farm. It's currently now being slowly built. It'll be the biggest wind farm in the world, in the middle of the North Sea, just off Teesside. Well, the idea is that we connect up with the Dutch, the Norwegians, the Germans, and we create a grid to benefit from the renewable power on the North Sea, in a way which allows us to transform our energy systems. So there's lots of work going on inside the European Parliament. That's what we do Monday to Thursday. And then Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we're out campaigning across the region. So yesterday we had the day off, I have to be honest. Well, actually, we didn't completely have the day off. We had a planning meeting for the referendum yesterday morning, because now that the local elections and the PCC elections are out of the way, and I think the result for the North East was not bad for Labour. We won seats in Newcastle. The PCCs all came back with good majorities. The one place where we have a real problem is Hartlepool, where UKIP are starting to rise up, but we had quite a good day for Labour across the region. But now the next kind of date on the calendar is the 23rd of June, when the whole of the country will decide whether we stay in or we leave the European Union. It's the decision of a generation, but it will affect many generations to come, because there's many people say, oh well, I don't know whether we should have joined in the first place. But it's kind of academic. We've been members for 40 years, and I think after 40 years in a marriage with other countries, any divorce will be painful. Even if we find some way of negotiating an exit, it will still have ramifications, and there will be damage to both sides. It will be damaging to the rest of the EU, and it will be damaging to the UK as well. And it's not, it's not a painless choice, essentially, whether we stay or leave. And equally, to be completely fair, if we decide to stay in, that will also have big implications as well, because it will be at a time when there's a real rise of nationalism across Europe. You see right-wing parties rising in national polls. I don't know if you saw the picture from Sweden of the neo-Nazi riot and the woman standing in front of neo-Nazis. Yeah. There's a rise of the far right across Europe. And the idea that Britain would vote to say, actually, we want to stay in the EU, to continue working with our neighbours, to continue to try and find common solutions to common problems around a negotiating table and not taking ourselves back behind national borders, that will also have quite big ramifications, because that will be a big statement to the rest of Europe at a time when there's a lot of instability in our region and in the world. I think it'll probably send quite a strong signal to the Americans as well, where the Americans' election is turning into a little bit of a horror show, I think. Yeah. So it's a really important decision that we take on the 23rd of June. The difficulty is that Europe isn't important to a lot of people. If you look at what people care about, Europe and our membership of the EU really matters to a really small minority. They feel really passionately about it, one way or the other. They want to be in or they want to be out. But the vast majority of people, whether we're a member of the EU, is kind of priority number 10 or 11 or 12 on their list. What they care about is the health service, education, jobs, the economy, immigration. These are questions which they care about. And so the dangerous thing is that lots of people don't feel that they have really anything at stake in this decision, and there's no reason why they should feel motivated to go out and vote. And what we're trying to explain to people, and this is a very simple way of explaining it, is basically what the North East has at stake in this referendum. And we think there are 5 really big things that the North East has at stake. The first is our jobs. So a lot of jobs across the region depend on our membership of the European single market. In fact, of all the UK regions, the North East is the most dependent on trade with the rest of the EU. About 13% of our economy regionally is dependent on that trade with the EU. So quite important. And it's funny, but there's a difference between regions in the UK. It's partly because we still make things. So as a region, we have a trade surplus. Lots of it is down to Nissan. We have to be very honest. Lots of it is down to the automotive sector, but not just the automotive sector. Also, the chemical sector is still very big across the region. New industries are growing, pharmaceuticals and biotech, very important sectors, and a few services sectors, financial, business services, lots of key things which we trade with other European countries. Those jobs, which are dependent on the EU, is about 160,000 jobs across the North East. So it's a big part of our local economy. Then as a region, because we're one of the poorest regions in the UK, we get more back per head from the European Union than any other region. It's one of those things that UKIP love it when we say it, but actually the European Union is kind of a socialist project. It's very rude. There is redistribution. When we contribute £1 of taxpayers' money to the European budget, what we're contributing to is a system of redistribution from the wealthy to poorer, from wealthy to poorer regions. In some cases, that means a transfer from the UK, which is one of the richest countries, to poorer countries in the EU, with the aim that you lift up the living standards in your neighbours and you reduce the negative competition in terms of terms and conditions with your neighbouring countries. But there's also redistribution between regions. So when we contribute our £1 taxpayers' money to the EU, we actually get most of that pound back directly in the North East, as well as the £10 that we get back in terms of benefits of trade, jobs, and the local economic benefits. So we're net beneficiaries of our EU membership, and that money is all over the region. If you start looking for it, you can see it everywhere. You see small European flags on community centres, on business development centres, on some of the big infrastructure build. A lot of it's quite hidden. So if you go to, in Stanley, the job centre and the community centre, that's all, and all the support for local people to find work. That's financed by European Social Fund money, for example, but it doesn't have a massive European flag stuck on it. So it's a bit invisible inside the community. Third reason, and I'll rush through this, but third reason is about those rights at work that I already talked about. If we leave, we will be at the mercy of a Tory government. We have fixed term parliaments. One thing that Tories are very good at is keeping hold of power, even if they've got internal splits and fractures. And the first thing, and you only have to look at the trade union bill and some of the legislation which has already come out, the first thing that they want to get rid of are those basic rights at work, which currently they can't get rid of. The fourth thing is around the environment. I got involved, I knew that we were part of the EU, and I got interested in European politics, partly because of my mum, who was a housewife in Middlesbrough and had 4 young children, and the government advertised Teesside as a good place to burn toxic waste. We'd lost a lot of jobs in the steel industry and in ICI, and they were trying to find new ways of creating jobs on Teesside, and they thought building big toxic waste incinerators was the up-and-coming idea in the late 1980s. My mum was part of the campaign to stop the building of those toxic waste incinerators. It was very sexy. It was called Stink, Stop Toxic Waste Incinerators in Cleveland. Very imaginative. They called for a public inquiry. They got a public inquiry. And during the public inquiry, they proved that the government had violated European environmental protection standards. And as a result, the UK government was blocked from building toxic waste incinerators in the northeast, but also the rules were improved for regions all across Europe to avoid that government can enforce and not undertake proper environmental impact assessments before any kind of building. So for me, that was something that happened in our house when I was 11 years old. Suddenly, there was a letter from Brussels saying, "Dear Mrs. Kirton-Darling, in your case against the UK government," I think she kind of held onto the kitchen counter a little bit. I don't think she realised that she was bringing a case against the UK government, but that's what happened. So I knew about it, but that environmental legislation has cleaned up this region dramatically. It's cleaned our beaches, our rivers, our air, and all of that is about public health in my view. Environmental protection isn't just a fluffy green agenda, it's a very core Labour agenda about improving the lives of ordinary people and improving public health. And finally, the last point is probably one of the biggest for the North East. We've produced the foot soldiers of every war in Europe, and we've fought our neighbours in Western Europe every 20 years for the last 1,000 years, more or less. Every generation has seen some form of war, and we as a region have supplied a lot of that cannon fodder. And this is the longest period of peace in Western Europe. And lots of people say, and UKIP regularly in Hustings say, it's nothing to do with the EU, it's NATO. Well, NATO hasn't kept the peace between Western European states. NATO is about external security. It's about a threat from outside towards NATO members. What's kept the peace in Western Europe is the fact that now 28 member states sit around a negotiating table, negotiating their differences. We're not all the same. We don't all want to be the same. A German doesn't want to be French. A Frenchman doesn't want to be Spanish. The Spanish don't want to be Swedish. We all have our own histories, our own identities, our own cultures. But instead of resolving our differences on a battlefield, we resolve our differences around a negotiating table. For me, that's absolutely at the centre of what the Labour movement stands for. The broader Labour movement, not just the Labour Party, but also the trade union movement. Working people working together rather than in conflict with each other. So that peace and security, we always take it for granted. My generation have never known war in Western Europe. My dad has never known war in Western Europe. But when I talk to my 98-year-old gran why she's campaigning for us to stay in is because she remembers what it was like in the 1940s. My granddad arrived in Britain 76 years ago this week. He was a refugee from Eastern Europe. He came across the Mediterranean in a rowing boat where there were more people bathing than there were people rowing. Similar kinds of images to what we're seeing now between Turkey and Greece. We live in a very, very volatile period of history. And in that volatile period of history, we have a choice on the 23rd of June about whether we want to increase the insecurity that we face economically and physically in terms of relations with our neighbours, or whether we want to show that actually we're committed to cooperating with people, building a peaceful world, and recognising that peace is a continuous process of negotiating. Sometimes it's really frustrating, but if you're not at the table negotiating, the danger is that you start to move towards the battlefields outside. And that's why I'm campaigning for in, and I hope that you'll join us. Thanks. And I'm happy to answer anything you have to say.
Yeah. Still looking at basically setting up a board of where we can invest in sort of prioritising things like jobs, and particularly on kind of regeneration of town centres and the villages around it. But have you had any experience from other MEPs or other areas where?
I mean, the only thing that I would say is that I think local knowledge is absolutely key for deciding how money's spent, because and that's where kind of the money, where possible, I think should be channeled into community partnerships, and the decisions should be taken by local people. If you make decisions in a kind of helicopter way, then quite often you can throw money at things, but it doesn't have legs and it doesn't have roots. Whereas if you're supporting what's already going on in local communities and you're just giving the extra boost to things which the local community already wants to be doing, then you're more likely to have a long-term sustainable benefit of that money, would be the only thing. But I think there's an awful, I mean, County Durham, the regeneration team under Neil Foster, I think recognised nationally as one of the top regeneration teams in the country, because they've done some really imaginative things with European funds where, you know, we talk about, lots of people complain about bureaucracy and form filling in and box ticking and all of this kind of thing. What you really need is a local authority who have a kind of vision and imagination of how you work within the rules. You don't break the rules, but you work within the rules to push forward what the local